Okay, getting you feedback is kind of important because we're moving through these modules and these activities, and it's important that I get you some information about your work. So that's the purpose of this video. Your P-level assignments I have graded. They will be scanned and posted to your D2L site, probably by this evening. In this video, what I want to do is I want to review a little bit about your P-level goals that you wrote for your student. And then I'm going to comment on the way that you looked at the standards, the Common Core standards, the English language proficiency standards, and the Wisconsin Early Learning standards, to kind of begin to match those with the needs of your students. So again, looking at expectations and matching them with student needs. And then I'll talk a little bit about your task, which is due at the end of this week. Understand that we're building on what we're learning about conversation and what it really, really requires for a student to be able to participate in a conversation, not just in the give and take of communication, but also in the content, in the ability to refer to things beyond themselves into a wider world. The form, the ability to use forms that others understand. I'm trying to remember what the other content, reference, form, and of course function, of which you all used a lot of function, and then also cohesion. So let's start by just looking at what you submitted. I put them all on one form matrix, and I'll share this with you, but I want to look at a few things. I wrote the goals. I wrote where it was referring to in terms of the P level, and then I gave you suggestions about rewriting. This is everybody's goals. I don't have names on them. You'll recognize yours, but I thought you would like the examples. The yellow really is the specific behavior, and so I focused on making sure these are examples of, in yellow, what people identified as specific behaviors, and these were actually quite good. The green is really about the context, and sometimes the context wasn't included. It can be general, so during informal and instructional conversations works, in one-on-one setting works. You can refer to the content when storytelling or retelling. You can talk about informal and formal conversations, but it's important to set the context. And then the third was the how would you measure it, or what's your criteria? 3 times per day, 5 times per day, 3 out of 5 times. Some people use percentages, but it's really hard for language, and so I tend to like to say I like the 3 times a day, or the 3 out of 5, although I probably would say 5 out of 5 because you want to work towards 100%. It's difficult to say a percentage because you have to know how many you have in the total to be able to get a percentage. So when you're observing, it could be a checklist where you identify 10 examples, and that may be a good enough criterion because, again, you're just trying to move to the next level. So you'll have more examples of that. All right, so let me get to... The other thing I want to talk about is what you suggested when you started looking at all the standards, and that was actually good. I just want to refocus us. We're talking about conversational communication. That is discourse, and it means interactions that you have between teacher and student, student and student. It's participation. It's contributing to a conversation, having contributions. It's collaboration, meaning that you are working with another person, communicating about something. It is inquiry, it's asking, answering questions. And so all of the other things like syntax, vocabulary, form, all of those really are things that we're going to look at in the next modules. So right now we're really focused on conversation. And many of these skills are really related to what you all and many other people talk about as advocacy skills. So the ability to have a conversation, to raise an issue, to talk about it, to make a request. Those are all advocacy, and many of these conversation skills are required to be able to do that. So when I looked at your language standards summary, and group 1, I looked at, you had some individual contributions, and group 2, I think you had it all in the form. There were some really good ones. There were some that were not necessarily related directly to conversation and interactive communication. So for example, one of the goals was around ability to detect, manipulate, or analyze auditory parts of spoken language. Really was out of the reading area. So make sure that you stay with the language standards. And that was from the early learning standards. There are communication or language standards there to refer to. The other thing is that there was one of the goals really focused on listening. Well, listening is a part of conversation. That's receptive language. But the conversational focus is really about then what do you do, or what's your response to listening. If you understand the communication, then what's your response? And so focusing on just receptive somehow does not address necessarily the conversation. The other, we had a lot of answering and asking questions, which is why we really want to, as you read in your text, a lot of what the text will talk about is focusing on questions. And so questioning as a way to facilitate conversation. The strategies they talk about, and this is one part of your final assignment for the end of this week, they talk about scaffolding or modeling and imitation. Imitation is a really powerful way to help students participate, learn about the skills required for conversation. They also talk about scripts, scenarios, and role-playing. Those are kind of all a similar thing. But it is setting it up so that you can actually model and participate in the kind of conversation and the kinds of skills you want your student to engage in. There is a part about repairing conversation. So how do you get clarification? How do you understand when someone doesn't understand you? And then how do you make yourself understood? And then how do you understand the other person's, clarify the other person's communication? And then there's a section really on questions and understanding that there's a difference between yes-no questions, WH questions, and then in particular this question about how. How is a very complex question. So it gives you a pretty good idea of some of the complexity of that. And I know that many of us, one of the frustrations often is I teach my student how to ask questions, and we go over it and over it and over it, and then they forget and they look like they don't understand questions. Well, you have to really look asking and answering questions across a variety of contexts and with lots and lots of practice. Because it does get more and more difficult as the content gets more challenging. So it's not just about questions, it's about content as well. So in your last and the assignment for the end of this week, this is the matrix that I ask you to look at. And it really helps us get even more clarity on what's our goal, but then where and how are we going to teach it? Is it going to be individual? That's where you often start, is in an individual context. Small group, regular classroom. This gets more difficult this way. And then are we going to be very explicit about the skill that we're teaching? If we're going, and that's usually step one, then are we going to get explicit about it, but within a context where the skill can be used? And then are we going to look at it and support it in a context where it's embedded with other learning activities? And I do have my example that I sort of kind of walk through the standards just like you did. And this is my goal. BJ will be able to gain information about curriculum content by asking and answering questions in informal small group classroom discussions, 8 out of 10 observed opportunities. Notice this is pretty broad. That's what a goal is. A goal is broader, and I might be working on this all year. And then how am I going to teach it? Well, I kind of walk my way through, and I show you how I start with some benchmarks here, and that's a couple of other. You'll have to identify benchmarks as well. But I might start in the first square, which is explicit one-on-one. He has to know what the questions are. He has to know and use questions to ask about information that he doesn't know, new information. We might develop authentic questions. We might work through a script or role play where he's asking and answering questions. That's very explicit instruction about questions, right? So that's where I might start. Then I might go into a context where I'm with a small group of students, where he gets the opportunity to use that skill within a context, a smaller context. And then I'm going to support him in the regular classroom. So you see this really as if this is a year-long goal, you can see how I'm going to really work my way through from explicit instruction to actually supporting it within the classroom. So that's this is where we're heading. And this is sort of the crux of your assignment. If you have any questions, let me know. I hope this helps.